welcome to this terrific Tuesday edition of Liquid Lunch on Newsmax TV. I'm John Tabacco. We're coming to you live today as we do every day, Monday to Friday, noon to 2 Eastern from the Newsmax headquarters, high atop Midtown Manhattan. Before getting into today's terrific show, let's go downtown to the New York Stock Exchange, where the Dow is slightly in the red this morning. Dow down about 52 points. As the left-wing media continues to try to instill fear into our economy by telling us we're facing a recession. Many of the fundamentals don't exactly tell that same story, but the market is down 52 after a big 300-point up day yesterday. And I think the market is in okay hands here going into the end of summer without some crazy tweets or some crazy geopolitical news. I think the market should be in a holding pattern right here. Before getting to today's show, and we have an unbelievable show for you today, Lisa Bloom is going to be joining us right after this. She represents some of the victims in the Jeffrey Epstein case. We're going to be talking about what recourse they have now that he's gone. It was released yesterday that he signed his will just 2 days before, and he had about $550 million with $54 million in cash. And before getting into all the other news of the day, I want to point out, as Donald Trump keeps pointing the finger at China and pointing out to the world that China has been ripping off America for years. In other news, right here in our capital markets, just last week we found out from the Department of Justice that the largest bank in China, Industrial and Commercial Bank of China, they were a subsidiary of Standard Bank, one of the largest banks in the world, pleaded guilty to a bid rigging scheme through their securities lending department. And this apparently ICBC and others like BNY Mellon and Deutsche Bank were engaging in this egregious scandal, basically to rip off U.S. institutions by lending them phantom shares that don't exist. And when Donald Trump talks about how China is trying to rip off our intellectual property, how they're trying to rip us off by dumping steel, by polluting, by paying unbelievably low wages and unfairly competing right here on our shores, ICBC just pled guilty to a $42 million fine. So China is at work in every place imaginable, even in our capital markets. So we'll keep our eye on that. We'll keep you posted. Department of Justice says the investigation is ongoing, so there should be more news to tell you about all the big banks and how they are hammering U.S. investors and institutions. And speaking of hammering, the man who hammers me every single day in the final segment of the show joins me again as usual, Frank Morano, managing editor of Liquid Lunch. Frank, good afternoon in the East.
Hello there, John. Happy Tuesday to you. We have a blockbuster show, as you mentioned. We're going to get to Lisa Bloom in just a moment. But first, there's a very important holiday which I am going to be speaking frankly about. So, of all days, what is today? Today is not just Al Roker's birthday, which is causing a lot of you to be celebrating, but it's a holiday you might not have known about, right? Today is actually, believe it or not, National Radio Day. National Radio Day is obviously pretty important to me because I work in radio, but let me tell you why I think this should still be important to you. These days, you hear less and less about plain old regular terrestrial radio. Even regular terrestrial radio shows like mine, people tend to oftentimes listen later on a podcast, or listen on their smartphone, or listen on a streaming app, or any way except an old-fashioned radio. Well, we were reminded a month or so ago why it's so important to make sure you have a radio. In the midst of a massive power outage here in New York City, in one of the busiest places in the world, you saw tens of thousands of people in the Midtown Manhattan completely without power. That means they couldn't charge their phone, couldn't charge their computer, and obviously couldn't watch television. And the only medium that would have been there for them was radio. If they had a battery-operated or hand-crank-operated radio, they would have been informed as to exactly what was happening. That's why it's so important that no matter what your media consumption habit is, television, internet, books, magazines, I can't stress enough the importance of owning a transistor radio, a battery-operated radio, any sort of portable radio that you don't have to plug in. Because radio is, for my money, still the most intimate medium, and it's by far the one that's there for you when you need it most. John?
Frankie, you're just an old soul, and you're a radio man at heart, and today is a joyous day.
That's
for
right.
You. I mean, you've
They
been,
should have given us the day off.
You've been
all the radio people.
practicing your radio skills since you were 13 years old.
That's right.
And it's nearly
before.
40 years of radio.
However long it is.
At this point. But no, there are great things we've learned, both of us, from radio, and we.
And that's one thing I get kind of bummed that there are more and more cars not even including options like an AM radio, because so many people just listen to, I don't know what you call Pandora or Spotify or these apps that are loaded on the car themselves. And I think that comes as a real detriment to not just those of us that are broadcasters, but to the radio listener.
No doubt about it. And Frank, I just want to take you back to my little soliloquy on the Industrial Bank of China. What do you think about China getting its tentacles into our capital markets and ripping off institutions and investors to the tune of $42 million in fines?
Look, I'm not the least bit surprised if you look what China's been doing when it comes to cybercrime, if you look at what it's done when it comes to the theft of 20 million applicants' data who applied for government jobs, if you look at how they'll manipulate the currency and steal our intellectual property, if it thinks it gives them, if they get even the slightest edge, I'm not surprised that they're trying to inject themselves into America's capital markets.
Yeah, and part of the scheme that they were involved in also included BNY Mellon, Bank of New York Mellon. It included Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank's been having some major problems here in the U.S. And, you know, our policymakers should take a closer look the next time the banks get in trouble at how these banks behave in good times. Some of the biggest banks in America and the world are still engaging in things like price rigging and fixing and manipulation. And
well, in the case of Wells Fargo, which has more banks than any branch in America, actually opening accounts without even having the customer's permission.
Yeah, and if anyone at Wells Fargo had a vowel at the end of their name and that was happening, there would probably be a RICO case.
It certainly wouldn't surprise me if that were the case.
I'm going to almost make a guarantee that as this ICBC case unfolds, the firm itself pled guilty, but no individuals were named. But my expectation is that we're going to see some individuals named. Well, they named one individual, and he doesn't have a vowel at the end of his name, which means he was probably a cooperator. But I would expect that there's going to be, the fall guys will be people with vowels.
Well, it wouldn't surprise me. It's going to be interesting to see how things turn out in the aftermath of Officer Pantaleo's firing, which we covered at length yesterday as it was breaking, because there are now concerns about policing in all of America's cities in terms of the detrimental effect this is going to have potentially on America's police forces. A lot of people saying that the so-called Ferguson effect or the so-called Freddie Gray effect is real, and that you're going to have police being far less aggressive and far less proactive in terms of policing.
Like the people are talking about the blue flu.
Right.
And we're going to have on the founder of Blue Lives Matter, Joe Imperatrice, who started this organization to stick up for cops, because blue lives do matter, and in fact, all lives matter. But Blue Lives Matter is a nonviolent advocacy organization that stands up for cops, and I want to hear from Joe Imperatrice and hear about all the great things Blue Lives Matter is doing for the NYPD. Last week, 10 days ago, we had on Scott Lebedo. He's a patriot artist, and Scott painted this huge painting of basically Mayor de Blasio throwing a bucket of water on the NYPD shield, as well as sticking a knife through the Big Apple. And it seems like the NYPD under de Blasio is under fire. And, you know, people talk about the blue flu. The one thing I know about the NYPD, like the other day when there were pressure cookers found in the subway station, The NYPD guys aren't thinking about, well, I'm mad today about this or that. They just run to the danger.
That's right. That's right.
And that's what makes the NYPD the greatest police force on earth, if you ask me. But around the country, we're seeing the deterioration of respect for police who are our public safety officers, and that's bad news.
Look, if you look at what's happening in Chicago or what's happening in Baltimore, I think, unfortunately, you could be seeing a preview of where New York is headed, because you see in both of those cities, prosecutors and political leadership, that if there's a dispute between a police officer and a perp, they will absolutely, no questions asked, side with the perp. And you're seeing not only an incredible degradation of morale in those cities, but you're seeing violent crime in both of those places through the roof, and people that really shouldn't be on the streets be let out by these renegade prosecutors who, don't seem to have any interest in prosecuting anybody.
Yeah, and even last week we talked to Michelle Eskenazi, the bail bond queen of New York and New Jersey. She was talking about this effort here, not only in New York and Jersey, but across the country for cashless bail. So you want to make the cops' jobs even harder. They lock a guy up, and then the guy doesn't have any money, but they still release him back on the street. And I think, violent crimes have like an 80% recidivism rate. So the law enforcement's job is getting harder, and the legislators are piling on, making it even harder. So we're going to talk to Joe Imperatrice about all that and what we can do to support the great men and women of the NYPD.
Well, it's interesting, and
around the country.
Hearing Bernie Kerik yesterday on this program, and then hearing the head of the PBA, Pat Lynch. There is a lot of anger at Commissioner O'Neill, the New York City Police Commissioner, at his decision yesterday. And it's going to be interesting to see if Joe Imperatrice channels that same anger that we heard from Bernie Kerik and from Pat Lynch. So remains to be seen what effect this is going to have.
All right. Well, we're going to have everything you want to know about Epstein, about the cops, about Blue Lives Matter. Hopefully, we're going to get a visit via Skype from Martha Bonetta and Jeff Webb, who were down at the border to report in on what the real conditions are down there from some real people. And as we come to the end of this segment, Bitcoin down a bit today, but at 10,700, above that 11,000 for the end of the week would be good news for everyone. Good news for you is we'll be back in 2 minutes. You're watching Liquid Lunch.